Good morning and welcome to Environmental Health Science 660. This is lecture 4, the first of 3 videos. This will begin our lecture on the Earth's major ecosystems. Now we'll begin this discussion with a definition of the term biomes, because when we go to describe the Earth's major ecosystems, we generally describe the large major plant communities that are found throughout the planet. These include things like tundra, which basically is found at higher latitudes, places like Alaska. TAIGA, which are conifer forests, and we'll talk a little bit about those northern latitude conifer forests. We also have temperate deciduous hardwood forests, very much like the oak climax that we have here in South Carolina. Then we'll talk a little bit about grasslands, places like the Great Plains and the savannas of Africa. Desert chaparral communities as are commonly found in the southwest U.S. Tropical rainforests as are found in places like Puerto Rico, El Yunque, and some of the places like that in Puerto Rico that are tropical rainforests, the Amazon, places like that. And then finally mountain complexes, places like the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians. This is a photograph of tundra habitat in northern parts of Alaska inside the Arctic Circle. You'll notice these slides are taken around May, late May. And as you can see, we still have some ice rafting along the shore. But you can see the mountain complexes in the background of the picture, and in the foreground, that brownish area are the tundra areas, which are just now starting to experience enough temperature and daylight extremes to foster plant growth. And these are highly productive communities found up in northern parts of Alaska. This is a shot of the tundra community about a month later. You can already see it's turned from brown to green. You'll notice the melting ice, waterfalls flowing over the sides of these down into the Bering Sea. And you can begin to see the lush vegetation that has literally taken off. You have to remember we have almost 24 hours of daylight here for about 6 to 8 weeks, and so growth is very rampant and very quick, but also very short. And by the end of August we're back into colder temperatures, and then back into snow by the end of September. This is a shot of our helicopter landing in this habitat up in Alaska, and you can begin to see again, this was in the May time frame as the temperature and ice is just starting to recede, and you can still see the habitat here in the foreground. Here we are. This is a photo of some of the summer growth of the tundra. You see the scale in the front. That's about a 30 centimeter scale, so it does give you a little bit of an idea of the complexity. There may be, this habitat is made up of lichens, grasses, as many as 20-30 species of lichens, and so you can really begin to see the extent and magnitude of the land cover here. Adjoining the tundra habitat, just immediately on the offshore or the onshore areas adjacent to the tundra as we move up into that slightly higher elevation, are these rocky intertidal zones that house marine mammals. These are walruses, fur seals, and you can see the complexity of this whole habitat in the Bering Sea. This is just another shot to again illustrate the intersection between this tundra habitat and then the mountain complex that you see in the background of this habitat. So you really have quite a bit of diversity in transitioning from one biome to another. You'll notice that these tundra habitats basically come right up to the shoreline. Here we see a sandy beach, and we see mountains in the background. Again, the mountain complex in the background, and that is a large river delta behind this spit of land that is holding back the water and melt from the mountain complex during the summertime through this delta. This happens to be the Kuskokwim River Delta in Alaska. Now here is a mountain complex maybe a little more familiar to people. This is the Rocky Mountains. Again, you can see very steep mountains and very lush vegetation on many of the slopes of these mountains. We can see in the foreground of this particular slide, this is a crater lake in Oregon, and you can see the mountain complex in the back and very little vegetation at these higher latitudes. You'll notice the taiga forest in the foreground, the conifer forest surrounding the lake, and so you get these ecotomes where we have overlap between these two different types of biomes. This is another example of a mountain complex in Alaska. You can see the fog in this particular mountain pass. You'll see the taiga vegetation of trees blending in with the tundra, the light green areas, as they move into that higher elevation on the sides of the mountain. This is another shot of the taiga, Boreal ecosystem forest. And again, you can see the conifer trees surrounding this crater lake. This is in Oregon. This slide is a slide of the Great Plains, and again we can see the lack of trees in this area, and pretty well a ecosystem dominated by grasslands. And this is, of course, our Great Plains, where much of our agricultural production is done in this country, and you can see why. Without having to clear the trees, this becomes a very easy area to cultivate, and so farmers have exploited that, as you can see in this particular slide. This is our desert chaparral community, and here the limiting factor is precipitation. And you can see the chaparral plants with the dry sand in between, and so lack of rainfall really dictates the type of vegetation that can survive here. Very extreme temperatures, very dry habitat for most of the year, and very highly adapted species, both plants and animals, to survive the rigors of the extreme warm temperatures in the day and cold temperatures at night, since we don't have the humidity at night to hold in the temperatures from the day, and so it gets extremely cold quickly, as well as extremely hot rather quickly as well. Another major biome are salt marshes. This happens to be a slide of salt marshes here along the South Carolina coast, and as you can see, we have quite extensive salt marsh areas in this region. This is a slide of a salt marsh right along highway, I believe this is Highway 7 in Charleston, using infrared photography. And infrared photography, wherever the plants turn red, means they're living, so you can see all of the salt marsh areas are red, along with some of the adjoining upland terrestrial vegetation in this slide, indicating the lush productivity and high productivity of the salt marshes. We have a number of species of plants within salt marshes. They're primarily dominated by a one grass Spartina alterniflora, but in this slide, which was in the previous two slides, but the green vegetation that you see here, that is called Salicornia, as opposed to Spartina alterniflora, which you saw in those earlier shots. So where I've got the cursor here, if you can see that, it's the green vegetation that you see in this slide. Another common salt marsh plant is the sea oxeye, and that's this plant with the yellow flower. And you can see that right behind the scale. Again, that's a 30 centimeter scale for scale. And so you can see the yellow flower on the sea oxeye, another dominant vegetation type within the salt marsh. This is Tommy salmons standing out again in the middle of the Spartina marsh, which is the low marsh vegetation. I should mention the sea oxeye and salicornia tend to dominate in the high marsh, that is the upper elevation of the marsh, higher elevation, whereas in the lower elevation that's more frequently flooded, we see the Spartina. So you can see Tommy standing right on the beginning of that fringe, and everything behind him is the Spartina alterniflora that we see dominating this entire system all the way out to the river's edge. Then this last shot again is Tommy standing here, and again using infrared photography by the Spartina, you can see again that all that vegetation is red, indicating that that is live plant material. And so you can see how extensive that Spartina can be, 3 to 4 feet high, can be even higher than that in some places, but usually no more than 5 feet, 5 to 6 feet. So you can see it right there, and that is a profile rod that's about 5 feet that he's holding. Now, one of the ways we can compare these different biomes in terms of their productivity as plant communities is to look at the amount of carbon produced in each of these systems. And we say that because carbon, as we said in the last lecture, the way in which we exchange energy flow in living ecosystems is exchanging carbon. And so the plants are able to, take in sunlight, convert that to through photosynthesis to produce sugars, which are exchanged as carbon, C6H12O6, the sugars, and so the carbon is exchanged as those kinds of molecules. And so if we take a look and compare our terrestrial systems, our least productive systems are desert shrub communities. They produce about 32 grams of carbon per square meter. That is, if you mark out a square meter and measure all the carbon in that square meter over a year, that's all you'll see on average, produced about 32 grams per square meter. Our tundra habitat, okay, let me go back. On the desert shrub, the limiting factor then is rainfall, and that's what limits the carbon production. The tundra, on the other hand, is about double that production, about 65 grams per square meter. The limiting factor here is temperature and sunlight, and obviously all of that carbon production is done in a very short time period, 6 to 8 weeks. But it's really the availability of sunlight and temperatures above freezing to sustain plant growth. Our third most productive community are the temperate grasslands and the savannas that we see in Africa, and the grasslands like the Great Plains here in the United States. They range from about 225 grams of carbon to 315 grams of carbon per square meter. Then the next, and again the limiting factors there are rainfall, because these areas can have wet and dry seasons, and the length of the growing season. Then our next most productive community are the Boreal TAIGA forest. Those produce about 360 grams of carbon per square meter per year. And then again, the limitation there is the type of vegetation, being conifers as opposed to hardwoods. They just don't produce as much carbon as a hardwood forest will. We see that in the next slide when you look at your temperate deciduous hardwood forest. Production goes up to 540 grams per square meter per year. And that's again a function of the types of leaves and the types of carbon that are available for exchange. And then finally, on the terrestrial side, our tropical rainforests produce about 900 grams of carbon per meter square per year. And again, the main reason the production is much higher than in a temperate deciduous hardwood forest is you have temperatures that sustain growth year-round in the tropical forest, whereas in the temperate and boreal forest, you have a limited growing season. Now, below the terrestrial biomes, we see the salt marshes and freshwater marshes. And what I will point out, the importance of salt marshes and freshwater marshes, as you can see, those systems produce nearly twice the amount of carbon per square meter per year, more than 2,000 grams of carbon per meter square. So clearly, when we take a look at biomes, that's why we have such a protected status on marshes, because they are among the most productive ecosystems known to man. Particularly our salt marsh habitats are home to most of the species of fish that we exploit both recreationally and commercially. More than 85% of all fish species that are exploited commercially or recreationally start their life in the upper ends of these salt marshes. Thus they become a nursery ground in addition to being a source of food. They're a place of shelter and refuge for many species. Now, another major type of biome are lakes. And lakes are simply depressions in the ground which are filled with water, and they can either be naturally occurring or man-made. Most of the lakes we have in South Carolina are man-made as opposed to natural. Natural lakes would be places like the Great Lakes, Lake Baikal in Russia, places like that, where a lot of the lakes were created by former glaciers that dug large holes, which then, as temperatures warmed, filled with water as opposed to ice. Now, when we go into lakes, we have a couple of terms we need to define. The epilimnion is the surface region of the lake at the top of the lake, which is characterized by warmer water temperatures compared to the bottom layers and has a higher amount of dissolved oxygen. The bottom of the lake is called the hypolimnion, and that's characterized by colder temperatures and very low dissolved oxygen. And then generally between the epilimnion at the top and the hypolimnion at the bottom, we have an area called the thermocline, which is a region of rapid temperature change, and also because dissolved oxygen is intimately related to temperature change, there's a rapid change in dissolved oxygen. Usually there is oxygen above a thermocline, and there's very little oxygen below a thermocline. So thermocline means rapid, cline means change, thermo means change, so rapid change in temperature. Now, lakes are generally sinks for pollutants associated with cultural eutrophication, i.e. urbanization. And so one of the biggest problems we have in lakes is nitrogen and phosphorus enrichment, along with trace metal pollution and PAHs in most urban settings. Also, we can have pesticides, because oftentimes as the cultural eutrophication persists in lakes, we get exotic plant growth, things like hydrilla and other species, so we actually have to use pesticides to knock down the levels of plant growth in the lakes. Otherwise, the lakes are not navigable by boats and useful for swimming, and also it retards the ability to fish in these lakes. So pesticides can be another source of pollution within these lakes. Now, another type of community are swamps. Now, swamps are low-lying, usually wetland or treed areas, because we have swamps that can be, they have things like cypress trees commonly associated with them, as well as grasses such as we see in the Everglades. These are important to regulate water flow during floods and drought. During periods of excessive rain, waters will flow into swamps and fill them up. During periods of drought, the swamps will draw down, releasing that water back into the river to help maintain water flow within the river. These are habitats for many rare species of birds, reptiles, and amphibians, particularly turtles, snakes, and alligators here in the southeast. Examples include cypress swamps and the Everglades down in Florida are two very good examples. The Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia would all be examples of this type of habitat. This next slide depicts another type of habitat with some sort of headlines, and those are river systems. And in this list, the 10 most polluted rivers in the United States, Potomac heads that list. And that's because of the enormity of all the population growth around the watershed, various types of point source pollution from sewage treatment plants, as well as non-point source pollution associated with urbanization. Closer to home, there are several rivers in Georgia, Chattahoochee, which is polluted, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in some other discussions later on in the class. So this slide and the next slide, I'm not going to go through all these different systems other than to say that we do have a list of the 10 most polluted rivers, and they're listed here. This slide lists the 6 through number 10 rivers in terms of the most polluted. I did want to mention one river system because I do think it warrants some further discussion. That is the Mississippi River. Now, of all the rivers in the United States, this is the biggest and drains the largest area, and clearly has had a history of pollution associated with it. In fact, at the mouth of the Mississippi River is an area called the dead zone, and we will talk a lot more about that when we talk about eutrophication. But the dead zone there is a function of all the agriculture in the river basin, all the way from the Great Lakes all the way south to Louisiana. The tremendous amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural runoff has resulted in major discharges of nitrogen and phosphorus into the Gulf of Mexico, which causes dead zone. And the dead zone is essentially an area, as the name implies, there's very little dissolved oxygen because of all the growth of plants and bacteria in this area, stimulated by the fertilizers of nitrogen and phosphorus. So as a result, you end up with this area that is devoid of life. We will talk a lot more about that later in our eutrophication lecture. The other reason I want to mention the Mississippi River is today the river is in a little better shape than it was in terms of chemical pollution, but back in the mid-70s, early 80s, particularly New Orleans being downstream of much of the pollution on the river, had become an area with very high rates of certain types of cancer, and these were associated with vinyl chloride and other plasticizers and other organic chemicals. And so the cancer rate in New Orleans was particularly high as a result of all this pollution. One of the things under the Clean Water Act we have done is to actually reduce some of these discharges coming out of industrial plants discharging into the Mississippi River. The problem was New Orleans was sort of the most downstream location, and that population was significantly affected by all the upriver pollution. I think this is something you have to really keep in mind about rivers. As you have more and more rivers, or more and more cities developed on a river, what becomes the waste for one city 20 or 30 miles downriver becomes the drinking water for another city. And so if each city is continually adding to that load, obviously by the time you get to the end of the pipe, that is New Orleans, that was why we had all these problems. So we really had to take some pretty drastic actions in reducing the what we call the point source discharges. Those are discharges from localized industries or sewage treatment plants along that waterway. Now the next habitat we want to talk a little bit about are estuaries. And estuaries are a semi-enclosed body of water with a free and open connection with the ocean, which is measurably diluted by precipitation. So essentially, estuaries typically occur at the terminus of many rivers, where those rivers enter the sea, and so they are this semi-enclosed body of water that has tidal exchange. Now, one of the things that's very important to talk about when we talk about estuaries, and we talked about the salt marshes earlier, the major vegetation in these estuaries will be Spartina of some sort, salt marsh grass, and other associated plants, as we showed you with some of those slides with the sea oxeye and the salicornium. Now, we oftentimes define estuarine areas by their tidal range, their vertical elevation, that is the vertical range from low tide to high tide. Now, if I go to the Gulf of Mexico and stand out on the beach, at high tide, the water will only be a foot above, 18 inches to a foot above the level at low tide. In fact, it's less than a meter in vertical range. If I come to South Carolina, the tidal range is anywhere from 5.5 feet in Myrtle Beach to nearly 9 feet, 9.5 feet down at Hilton Head. And that is what we call a mesotidal range, 1 to 3 meters, which would be so roughly 3 to 9 feet. And then finally, we have macrotidal regions, which are extremely high tide range, oftentimes over 20 feet. And we say anything with a tidal range more than 3 meters, more than 9, almost 10 feet. An example here would be the Bay of Fundy up just in the northern edge of southern edge of Canada, upper parts of Maine, in the Bay of Fundy. Now, let me ask a question. Of these different types of tidal ranges, where do you think you're going to have the greatest amount of water quality problems, water quality pollution problems? Well, what we have found is clearly the areas with the smallest tidal range, that is places like the Gulf of Mexico, have more water quality problems than areas with larger tidal ranges. Generally, the water coming in from the ocean has very low background levels of primarily airborne pollutants that fall out of the atmosphere into the oceans. But we have no localized terrestrial sources of pollution out in the ocean. And so because of that, the water that normally comes in and exchanges within an estuary is much cleaner than the water that's being discharged down the river out into the ocean. So clearly the amount you dilute that water has a major impact on the water quality. And so as the typical definition of pollution, the solution to pollution is dilution. The greater the amount of dilution, that is the greater the tidal range, generally the better the water quality. So we generally tend to find places like the Gulf of Mexico have very impaired waters, whereas as you move into areas with much higher tidal ranges like South Carolina, upper end of the mesotidal range or the macrotidal range, because of the dilution with clean ocean water, we don't see as many water quality problems. We mentioned earlier the fact that estuaries are nursery grounds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the class, but suffice it to say that we see these areas are extremely protective. In fact, we have many species such as shrimp and finfish that start their early life stages offshore out on the continental shelf, where eggs hatch, the first stage larvae emerge. Those larval stages move onshore into the estuaries, swim all the way to the upper ends of the estuary to what we call tidal creeks. And then from there, the shrimp and fish mature and move back out into the larger rivers and sounds within estuaries, and then eventually move back. So these organisms will move back out into the ocean, but here we see these organisms start their life, the finfish and shellfish, in what we call tidal creeks. And these tidal creeks are what we call first-order streams. They're the smallest streams within an estuary. So here we see a typical tidal creek at low tide. You'll notice most of the water has drained out of this creek. There's just a very small amount of water. And if you go and examine that water, though, it would be loaded with many, many diverse species of fish and shellfish. In fact, 85% of the finfish on the southeast coast that are commercially or recreationally exploited start life right here in these little tiny tidal creeks. Now, what's important here is our studies of urbanization have shown while these are the most important habitats as far as nursery ground functions go with finfish and shellfish, these are also the places with the highest amount of land-based pollution because they are the first-order streams draining land from urban areas. Thus, what we have to do in terms of developmental guidelines is we have to protect the water quality of runoff going into these areas because we can have tremendous impacts on finfish and shellfish here with runoff of pesticides, petroleum hydrocarbons, also trace metals and nutrients and microbial pollution. So our battle lines are really drawn in the protection of estuaries in winning the battle here. If you reduce the amount of pollution here as these tidal creeks run out into larger tidal creeks and into bays and sounds, the water continuously gets diluted. So the highest concentrations will be found here, and you'll have much lower concentrations, much more mature life forms of each species in those larger systems. Thus, the effects of pollution are much less severe. So we have to really protect these areas in order to sustain the health of the entire estuarine system. This is just another shot. We oftentimes sample these creeks to measure their function and health, and here you can see we have put out nets at high tide and it's now low tide, and so you can see that depth of that tide is just a couple inches, and so we are collecting the contents of our net and collecting all those animals to see what is in these systems. We work a lot with a little species of shrimp called the grass shrimp, Paleomenides pugio, that resides in these tidal creeks, and it's called the grass shrimp because it converts the Spartina marsh that you see on the edge of these creeks and in the foreground to your right here of the front part of this slide. That's all Spartina alterniflora salt marsh, and so it converts that Spartina into detritus, and so that's why that grass shrimp plays such a big part. If we block seine these creeks, that one species of shrimp, the little grass shrimp, it's not an edible species that humans eat, but it is the base of the food web for all the finfish that come up there. They start life eating little tiny crustaceans called copepods. They move up the food size as they get larger to a class of crustacean called amphipods, and then they finally end up eating grass shrimp. And so the grass shrimp become a very important staple of the diet for finfish and other predatory organisms in these systems. And it's very amazing, the sea bass, the grouper, all of the species that you catch offshore out on the continental shelf in commercial and recreational fishing start their life right here. And without the grass shrimp and this complex nursery ground function that we have here, these systems do not function. The grass shrimp on an annual basis, if you collect all the large macrofaunal animals, what we call macrofauna, the large animals, in these creeks, the grass shrimp makes up 56% of all the abundance of animals in these systems, underscoring its importance as a forage species for these commercially and recreational important finfish and shellfish. Here's a shot of the Spartina alterniflora marsh. You can see an individual plant growing here. You'll also notice that the ground here is very disturbed, and the reason I wanted to show this slide is that the ground is alive. It is full of what we call bioturbation, and that means many animals live in these sediments and continually turn these sediments over. In fact, we estimate that just one species of worm that lives in these sediments, a polychaete, can turn over the top 35 centimeters of sediment on an annual basis. So what that means is anything that falls to the surface as pollution is recycled because of all the biological activity in these systems through these, what we call the benthic, or the bottom food web in these sediments. So there's besides the salt marsh, there's another habitat of the detritus in these sediments that is very important in this whole estuarine food web. You'll notice this is a shot of the Spartina along the shore, grading into a little tidal flat here. And across that tidal flat, you'll notice these little brown rows. That is not plant matter. Those are actually polychaete worms called Diapetrocupria, and they basically are parchment tomb worms, and they build these tubes that are actually sticking up there and running in these linear rows. So those are rows of row houses for worms here on the marsh flat, the tidal flat rather, there in the adjoining tidal flat by this salt marsh. So that amount of bioturbation, I just want to illustrate that by talking about how productive these are. You don't need to remember all the names of these species. You need to remember the grass shrimp, but these other species, I'm just naming them. But we certainly need to remember the Spartina marsh because it's so important. But some of these other organisms like the worms, you just need to know the sediments are alive and are constantly turned over. And again, just to illustrate, here's another species of worm. You can actually see this pile of mud there in the center of this photograph. That is actually the fecal mound from a parchment, from a worm. This actually is Balanoglossus or Sacloglossus. I'm not sure which species is called the stinkworm. And that mound is full of iodide. If you pick it up, your hand's going to stink of iodine. And you'll also notice there's a little trace in the sediment to the right of that mound of sediment. Looks like a check mark there. Well, that's the trace of some of your snails that burrow across those sediments. So the point here is that these are not just dirt sediments. These are sediments full of organisms, full of very high diversity, and which makes these very dynamic habitats. This happens to be a kind of an iconic, I like to say, shot. If you've ever been to Charleston, that's the round Holiday Inn in the background of that shot. This happens to be the land right across the street from it, which has been, as you can see, bulldozers have been in here grading that land, but you'll notice there's some green grass there. Well, that actually is salt marsh vegetation, and so this site could not be graded and developed. And so if you ride by there today, it's still salt marsh because this area cannot be developed. I remember meeting the developer out here at this site, and he wanted me to come out and inspect this site to see if it was marsh vegetation. Indeed it was. And he told me, I can remember very vividly standing here, and he says, "You mean to tell me this little green plant is going to mean I can't develop the site after spending millions of dollars?" And so I said yes. And so today this site still is not developed because of the value of this salt marsh. So anyway, if you ride by Charleston going on the Ashley River Bridge, look to your right as you're coming out of town, and you'll see this piece of land. It's still undeveloped and will remain so because it is protected as salt marsh and as estuarine habitat. And here you can see this vegetation. This is what we call high salt marsh vegetation grading into the salt marsh behind it and in the low salt marsh. And so obviously he knew the salt marsh in the background of that slide was protected. He just did not realize some of these plants that are growing on this upper higher marsh area were protected. And in the past, back in the 60s, early 70s, really till probably the mid 70s, it was not uncommon to go in and dump sand on these high marsh areas, fill them, and build on them. But after the passage of the Tidal Act here in South Carolina and other protective federal legislation, we no longer do these types of things in salt marsh areas. This is one last look of the salt marsh community here in South Carolina. This happens to be a shot of the Highway 7 bridge in Charleston over the Ashley River. Here you can see the adjoining highland to the left. That's a wooded hammock. You can see the high marsh grading out of that into the salt marsh. You can also see the little tiny tidal creek running just to the left of the bridge, running back up toward that sandy dike area. Many former areas we would dike these areas, we would dike these areas like for runoff purposes to control some of the runoff off the bridges, but we no longer allow these dike areas because it reduces the productivity. So as you can see, this is running right out to I-26. So if you're ever in Charleston, if you get off on the Highway 7 bridge over the Ashley River, you can ride right by there and see this area. Okay, I had the percentages wrong. Here are the exact percentages. Georgia has 32.7%, South Carolina 30%. So you can clearly see we dominate with 63% roughly of all the salt marsh here in the United States. And most of your other states have this very low percentage. Even a state like Florida only has 8%. So you can really see the dominance that we have here in the large expansive marsh we have in South Carolina. Now, this next slide really kind of underscores the importance of areas like salt marshes and coastal ecosystems and estuaries. Our American coasts are a vital part of our nation's economy. They provide over 75% of the total commercial fish catch and 80 to 90% of the recreational fish catch in the U.S. So when we talk about the importance of estuaries, I cannot underscore why they're so important. They also are a mecca for creating jobs. For every $1 million we have invested, for example, in the Recovery Act starting in 2008, we created more than 30 jobs for each $1 million invested. That was twice as many jobs as were produced in the oil and gas industry and in road construction combined. So, and I'll show you in the next slide how productive we see on the job front these restoration projects in coastal areas are, particularly in estuarine areas. In 2007, the coastal counties of the U.S. produced over half of the gross domestic product for the U.S. and 40% of the nation's jobs. So I cannot underscore how significant. We can see in this slide how we have not been a good steward of maintaining water quality and ecosystem condition in many parts of our estuaries of the U.S. For example, if we take a look at the Columbia River Basin, 97% of our salmon are gone. If we go to San Francisco Bay, 95% of our wetlands have been lost. If we go to the Great Lakes, 50% of our wetlands have been lost. Chesapeake Bay, 99% of our oysters are gone, as we have said earlier. If we go to Galveston Bay, we see that 85% of our seagrass habitats are gone. If we go to the Gulf of Mexico, we've lost more than 50% of our wetlands at a rate of loss of about 1 football field per hour. So we are not doing a good job, and we have not been good stewards as we should be, but we're suddenly beginning to recognize the importance of the coastal zone for job creation and for our economy. And so because of that, we have begun to be much more of an advocate for maintaining conditions in these areas and preserving and being more conservation minded. As a result, we are really trying to protect these areas moving into the future. This is a slide looking at money invested in what we call green jobs, green sustainable jobs in the U.S. As part of the economic recovery plan for the U.S. And so what we see is these are different restoration projects around the U.S. but we see that the number of jobs created per $1 million invested in those coastal habitat restoration projects that spent about $1 million for each $1 million. We saw 20 to 32 jobs, on average about 30 jobs created per $1 million invested. If we take a look at road construction projects, oil and gas projects, and green building projects, the number of jobs created per $1 million invested ranged from 5 to 17. So clearly, if you added all those up, all three of the other activities, the roads, oil and gas, and green, you only begin to see the total number of jobs approaching what we get on the coastal habitat. So really, there's about a 3-to-1 ratio between coastal habitat investments and these other green energy investments. So clearly, if we're going to spend money on job creation, we should really spend it on restoration projects, because not only do we reap the benefits of seeing, environmental conditions improve and the quality of life improve, but we also create nearly 3 times more jobs per dollar spent. Now, the next type of habitat our example of biomes we want to talk about are mangrove forests. We've talked about estuaries with salt marsh, and those are common in more temperate zone areas such as South Carolina. If we go to more tropical areas like down in Florida and into the Caribbean, we see the salt marshes replaced by mangrove forest. This happens to be a beautiful, lush mangrove forest in Puerto Rico, and you can see it adjoining the adjacent coastal zone with grass flats and offshore, beautiful offshore areas that inundate the salt marsh. Rather, mangrove areas, not salt marsh, but the mangrove areas. Now, the mangrove forests replace salt marshes in these areas in terms of being nursery ground and performing that same function as salt marshes. So we'll go through and explore some of this in the next couple of slides. This is what we call a red mangrove forest, and this is a fringing red mangrove forest. And as you can see, these are very lush trees that are able to grow in standing water. The trees, that was a high tide shot, this is a low tide shot. The trees have this extensive system of roots that actually grow into the ground. And as you can see in this slide, they anchor the plant so that these red mangroves can grow right on the shoreline and be able to withstand the rigors of tidal exchange and wave action as the tide moves in and out. Now, that prop root system at high tide becomes a refuge for your early life stages of fish and shellfish who swim into those complex root systems and hide out away from predators until the tide goes out, and they then come out into the water around the prop roots. You'll also notice on the prop roots there's a lot of growth. There are oysters, and there's a whole what we call prop root community growing on those prop roots that you see in the foreground of this slide. This is a little better shot of that prop root community. You can actually see all the algae and oysters and barnacles and other organisms growing off these prop roots in these systems. So these are very, very productive systems. One of the things that's most important is the lungs of these plants actually reside in these prop roots. These prop roots have very specialized cells called lenticels, and these lenticels are sites of oxygen and CO2 exchange. And so it's very important that these prop root communities remain very healthy and function well. This is a shot to show you the real refuge fish and shellfish larval stages, early life history stages, are able to escape to at high tide. As you can see, this creates a series of baffles and hiding places, what we call refugia, where these finfish and shellfish species, red snapper, mangrove snapper, all these different finfish species that we like to catch, grouper, start their earliest life stages right up in this mangrove complex. So this becomes a very, very important habitat just as our salt marsh, as a nursery ground. Now, in addition to the red mangroves, which you see the prop roots growing down in the back part of this slide, if you look in the foreground, you'll see these prop roots growing up. This is the prop root for another species of mangrove besides the red mangrove. These are called black mangroves, and their root systems grow up. So you can see that where you have the overlap between red and black mangroves, the fish and finfish can swim right into those areas at high tide and hide out away from predators. So this becomes a very significant baffle system that protects these areas. Both the black mangroves and red mangroves have the lenticels on these prop roots. And for example, if we were to have an oil spill into this area and you coated these roots with oil, these trees will become diseased and will die. And we'll talk a little bit more about that one and show you examples of that when we talk about oil pollution. As you can see, this is a red mangrove community in Tampa, Florida, Tampa Bay, Florida. And you can see it, the red mangroves growing right out of a tidal flat with adjoining oyster beds around it. Again, this whole complex becomes an estuarine complex, even though it's not salt marsh, it's mangrove. And in Tampa, what we have is actually a mixture of red mangroves and Spartina, because it's a transitional tropical temperate zone. And so that's what we really see here in this slide. Further south, you're going to find mangroves. Further north, it's going to be Spartina. But this is a transitional area where you have both species. Now, the next biome I want to talk about in habitat are our continental shelf and oceanic areas. Now, when we look at the oceans, 90% of the Earth's surface are oceans, and we have an area we call, excuse me, not 90%. 90% of our ocean areas are called oceanic areas, which are your deep water areas. And of course, the oceans and continental shelf areas are the largest habitat on Earth. So when we take a look at the ocean areas, though, even though they're deep water, they only produce 4% of the fish production in fish catch, commercial fish catch. If we take a look at the continental shelves, they only represent 10% of the oceanic area, but they produce 96% of the finfish. And so you generally see we can have continental shelves without upwelling, and about 9.9% of the 10% that is continental shelf. So about 99% of the continental shelf area does not have upwelling. And then we have 0.1% of the continental shelf area, or 1% of the continental shelf area has upwellings. Now, what do I mean by upwellings? Upwellings are conditions where nutrients, prevailing wind conditions allow bottom water to move to the surface enriched with nitrogen and phosphorus. When that occurs, you get exotic growth of algae. When you get exotic growth of algae, you have large productions of biomass which sustain herbivorous fish like menhaden, anchovies, things such as this that are herbivores. And so these are some of the most productive fish areas in the world. And so one of the reasons we have a 200-mile exclusive zone is to protect the fishing rights out on the continental shelf, which extend out in the United States out to about 200 miles. Also, it protects oil, gas, and mineral rights in these areas. Now, the economic exclusion zones, and you can see them depicted on these slides, include waters 3 to 200 miles, 5 to 322 kilometers offshore, and it depends on where you are. Some states have bigger exclusive zones than others, like Florida and Texas. Coastal states are responsible for the inshore waters out to 3 miles. Everything out beyond that are federal waters, and thus are regulated by federal permits for things like drilling rights for oil and natural gas and minerals. We also exclude foreign fleets in these areas, so that people cannot come in and take fish species off the shore of one country and bring them to another. And so this has all been negotiated by international treaties to protect the fishing rights of countries around the world. This is a slide of the world fishery production, and just as you can see, the dominant species that we see caught in world fisheries are pelagic, that is water column fish, and demersal marine fish. So pelagic and demersal marine fish are your most dominant fish species. We also have freshwater fish, which make up a small percentage, less than 5%, but you can generally see that the marine fish make up the bulk of most of the fish species caught. You'll also see the crustaceans and mollusks in brown and tan make up a small percentage, as well as some of the aquatic plants. And those are the major exploitable species, types of species that we see in commercial fisheries around the world. Now this is the most interesting slide. In 1991, when I taught this class, as you look at this slide, you'll notice that aquaculture only made up about 1 to 2% of the total world fish catch. But as we take a look in 2010, you'll now notice that aquaculture makes up nearly half of all the world fishery production. Now, if you talk about a growth industry, aquaculture has been one of the most significant growth industries we have seen in the last 20 years. You don't hear an awful lot about it, but if we did not have world aquaculture production like we have today, we would have major shortages of most fish species such as shrimp and other species if we did not have this. So as you can see in this slide, the tremendous growth of this industry in the green there in the last 20 years. Now these continental shelf areas become very important. This happens to be an oil slick out on the continental shelf as a result of a release of petroleum out in this area. So we have to be very mindful of protecting these fishery rights out in these areas, and also the coexistence of other commercial activity out in these areas. We'll talk about both the Ishtok oil spill. This happens to be the Ishtok oil spill, which was uncapped for almost a year, spilling oil into the Gulf of Mexico for 9 months in 1979. And then we'll also talk about the BP spill, the Deepwater Horizon spill, which discharged oil only for about a month and a half to 2 months. And we'll talk about some of the economic impact, but here you can clearly see the oil spewing into the Gulf of Mexico, the oil burning at the surface in this region. Now, just to kind of illustrate mismanagement, I like to say, this is a slide of the Gulf of Mexico. And all of those little red dots that you see there are oil wells. And some of those lines that you see are the underground pipelines connecting the oil flow back to land. So when somebody says the Gulf of Mexico is a pristine habitat, I think you probably should correct them. It is a highly developed commercial enterprise. And so it's no wonder that we have had 2 major oil spills here, because it is a location of many, many complex activities on the continental shelf. And we'll come back and talk a lot more about this when we talk about oil later in the class. But I just want to make this point to you that this is a major issue that we have to deal with. And we'll talk a whole lot about oil spills in a subsequent lecture later in the class. Now, in your readings, you notice I have focused a little bit on the importance of salt marshes, estuarine areas, mangrove habitat, because they are the nursery grounds for fish and shellfish. And then I've talked about the importance of coastal areas in terms of job creation and economic activity, because half of the world's economic activity occurs there, and also much of the world's protein production occurs in fisheries, both in natural fisheries and aquaculture. And we then talked a little bit about the continental shelf areas, how that is where almost all of our oil is produced worldwide. So when we really start to talk about what makes the world go round, it really is these coastal areas, although all these biomes are important in terms of their contribution to planet Earth. Now, I wanted to talk about this reading by Dr. Dickoff at our Northwest Pacific Science Center in Seattle, who has written a book called The Seafood Dilemma. And one of the things he really talks about is seafood benefits versus seafood risk. And some of the benefits, if for example, if every adult in the U.S. consumed 8 ounces of salmon per week, there would be 20,000 fewer deaths due to heart attack and 8,000 fewer strokes each year, deaths related to strokes because of the omega-3 fatty acids. And so I cannot underscore the importance of why protecting fish and eating fish is so important. It's probably one of the very most we talked earlier about causes of death. And as you recall, heart attack and stroke were the number 1, number 2. And so literally you would reduce the number of deaths by 10 to 20% from just this one activity of eating salmon once a week. Since this is the major cause of death. These are the 2 major causes of death. What about the quality, though, of the product? If we're going to eat it, is it safe to eat? There are more than 2,000 mercury advisories and more than 1,000 advisories for organic pollutants in the U.S. In fact, mercury advisories constitute 80% of all impaired waters in the U.S. And when we talk about mercury impairment, it is not because of localized mercury pollution from industrial discharges, with the exception of a couple of places like Lavaca Bay, Texas, where we've had an industrial source. But by and large, most of the mercury pollution we have in the U.S. is a byproduct of the combustion of coal. And so when we talk about mercury pollution, it really is a climate change issue, because it really goes back to our energy policy of combusting coal. Now, we also have to be concerned, because we do not produce enough seafood in the U.S., about the quality of the seafood we import. And we'll talk later about circle of poison pesticides and how many of the pesticides we ban, like DDT in this country, are still used abroad to control malaria and other vector-borne diseases. And if we import foods, and particularly seafood, from these countries, those same very banned pollutants in this country show right back up on our dinner table. And so we'll talk about that. One of the problems we have with imports is a very small, less than 1% of it is inspected into the future to ensure the safety of a domestic food supply with the international sources of food, particularly seafood. We're going to have to continue to invest more money in inspection of seafood. If we don't do that, we're going to have big problems. So the solution is to have more inspectors and better inspection techniques so that we can more quickly inspect food and make sure the quality of the food is safe for human consumption. Finally, I want to end with this shot of what I consider to be one of the most interesting things that holds great promise for the future. Scientists at the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources at the Waddell Mariculture Center, they have developed a way to grow shrimp for shrimp aquaculture, which is our #1 seafood import. And I should mention that seafood imports rank #2 behind petroleum in terms of imbalance of trade. So when we talk about shifting jobs offshore to other countries, we ship our jobs for energy exploration of oil and production offshore, and we also ship our jobs for food production offshore. And this is an area where we should be investing to produce food in our own country, so that we're food independent and we're not having to rely so much on foreign seafood. What they have done in this particular study is using an enclosed raceway, as you can see in this greenhouse, you can literally, and this is a closed system, you can literally grow shrimp in Kansas, producing over 69,000 kilograms of shrimp per hectare per year. That's 2.5 pounds of shrimp per liter. So as you can see in this raceway, this is a huge production. There are only two other crops you can grow and make more money on, and they're both illegal, and that's marijuana and poppies. And so this particular production holds great economic potential. And I'd just be real honest, if I were a young person starting out in life, being a marine biologist like I was, I would really be looking at going into this kind of industry, because this is clearly going to be a huge growth industry for the future. Right now, the U.S. imports more seafood than any other nation in the world. And anything we can do to offset that importation, such as this activity, we should, if we're going to do environmental subsidies, we should subsidize this industry to get it off and running and then let it develop. And we would have much more independence on our seafood supply in the future. So I don't oftentimes, say I support subsidies, but I think sometimes you have to get an industry, you have to have something to catalyze an industry so it can take off. So in closing our lecture here, I think the bottom line is you have seen the major Earth's ecosystems. We've talked about their importance, and we've talked about why we have to protect these wonderful habitats, whether they be terrestrial habitats or whether they be salt marsh habitats. So we'll move on from here and talk in our next video on population. So thank you, and we'll talk with you in just a bit on populations.